Steps echoed through the marble halls of the Manhattan family court as a man swaggered in, hand in hand with his 24-year-old mistress, ready to leave his wife of 10 years with absolutely nothing. Richard thought he held all the cards. He was the flashy founder, the breadwinner, the undeniable master of his corporate empire. His wife, just a quiet, subservient spouse who didn't know the first thing about high-stakes business. Or so he truly believed. What Richard didn't know was that the very company he boasted about, the empire he supposedly built from the ground up, was entirely owned by a shadow corporation. And the ruthless, controlling CEO of that parent corporation? The quiet woman sitting directly across the aisle. Stick around, because this courtroom showdown is about to deliver a reality check so brutal it will leave you utterly speechless. Fluorescent lights hummed a low, sterile tune inside courtroom 302. The air was thick with the suffocating tension that only a high-net-worth divorce could generate. Catherine Caldwell sat motionless at the petitioner's table. Dressed in a modest charcoal gray suit, her dark hair pulled back into an immaculate but simple chignon, she looked exactly how her husband expected her to look. Defeated, exhausted, and hopelessly out of her depth. Beside her sat Arthur Pendleton, senior partner at Pendleton & Carmichael, a white-shoe law firm known for quietly dismantling Manhattan's elite. Arthur was casually arranging thick manila folders on the mahogany table, his demeanor infuriatingly serene. Catherine kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look at the heavy oak doors at the back of the room. She didn't need to look. She could hear him coming. Richard Caldwell never just entered a room. He announced his arrival to it. He pushed through the swinging doors with a booming laugh, flanked by his aggressive defense attorney, Gregory Houseman. But it wasn't just his lawyer that Richard had brought to a binding legal proceeding. Clinging tightly to Richard's left arm was Chloe Jenkins. Chloe was a former marketing intern at Richard's company, Caldwell Tech Innovations, and she looked entirely out of place in a court of law. She wore a tailored crimson designer dress that screamed for attention, accessorized with a diamond tennis bracelet that caught the harsh fluorescent light. It was a bracelet Catherine knew well, considering she had seen the bank alert when $45,000 was wired from their joint account to a luxury jeweler in the Diamond District 3 months ago. Bringing a mistress to a divorce hearing was a breach of courtroom etiquette so profound it bordered on theatrical comedy, but Richard didn't care. In his mind, he was already victorious. He was a self-made titan, a man who had taken a fledgling logistics software idea and turned it into a $50 million enterprise. Catherine, on the other hand, was just the woman who had packed his lunches when they lived in a cramped Brooklyn apartment. She was the past. Chloe was his shiny, expensive future. Richard leaned over and whispered something into Chloe's ear, making her giggle a sharp, piercing sound that caused the court stenographer to look up in irritation. Richard then confidently unbuttoned his bespoke navy suit jacket and took his seat at the respondent's table, throwing a smug, pitying glance in Catherine's direction. "You really didn't have to drag this out, Kate," Richard said across the aisle, not bothering to lower his voice. "We offered you a very generous settlement. $2 million and the house in Connecticut. You could have lived comfortably. Now my lawyer is going to have to explain to the judge why you deserve far less." "It's just business, darling." Catherine slowly turned her head, her expression entirely unreadable. She didn't snap. She didn't cry. She just stared at him with cold, calculating eyes. "Business," Catherine echoed softly. The words sounded foreign coming from her lips. "Yes, Richard. Let's talk about business." Gregory Houseman, Richard's attorney, chuckled and leaned in to whisper to his client. Houseman was a shark, renowned for intimidating spouses into settling for pennies on the dollar. He had reviewed the Caldwell's financial history and saw a clear-cut case. Richard was the CEO, the face of the company, and the sole registered operator of Caldwell Tech Innovations. Catherine's name wasn't on the founding LLC documents. She had no formal employment history for the last 7 years. To Houseman, This was a slam dunk. "Don't let her provoke you," Houseman muttered to Richard. "Pendleton is just going to try to paint you as a cheater to sway the judge on alimony. But New York is a no-fault state. Your extracurricular activities," he gestured subtly toward Chloe, who was busy taking a selfie in the gallery benches right behind them, "won't impact the equitable distribution of the corporate assets. The company is yours." Richard smirked, leaning back in his chair. "I know it is. I built it. She literally stayed home and read novels for a decade. She doesn't even know what a P&L statement is." At exactly 9 a.m., the heavy wooden door beside the bench swung open. "All rise," the bailiff barked. "The Honorable Judge Beatrice Lawson presiding." Judge Lawson took her seat. She was a woman in her late 60s with silver hair and a reputation for having absolutely zero tolerance for grandstanding. She adjusted her reading glasses, peered down at the docket, and then raised her eyes to scan the room. Her gaze paused for a microsecond on Chloe in her bright red dress, her brow furrowing slightly, before she looked down at the lawyers. "Good morning, counsel," Judge Lawson said, her voice dry and gravelly. "We are here for the matter of Caldwell v. Caldwell. I have reviewed the preliminary filings. Mr. Houseman, your client is contesting the division of the primary asset, Caldwell Tech Innovations, claiming it is separate property despite being founded during the marriage. You have the floor. Let's hear this justification." "Not a thing." Gregory Houseman stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced theatricality. He walked over to the podium, radiating pure confidence. "Thank you, Your Honor. The defense acknowledges that Caldwell Tech Innovations was technically incorporated 3 years after my client and the petitioner were legally wed. However, we are invoking the active appreciation precedent. Mr. Caldwell is the sole engine of this company's success. He secured the patents, he managed the late-night negotiations, and he alone courted the venture capital that kept the business afloat during its turbulent first years." Houseman paced slightly, gesturing toward Richard, who tried to look stoically heroic. "Mrs. Caldwell made zero financial or intellectual contributions to this enterprise. Furthermore, the company was entirely restructured 2 years ago. To save it from insolvency, Mr. Caldwell aggressively sought outside funding. The business is currently heavily leveraged by its primary investor, a private equity firm. Therefore, liquidating or splitting Mr. Caldwell's remaining shares would not only destroy the business, but violate the fiduciary agreements he has with his board. We are offering a lump sum of $500,000 and the marital residence, which is more than fair given Mrs. Caldwell's lack of contribution to the marital wealth." Judge Lawson made a note on her legal pad. $500,000 out of an estimated valuation of $50 million. That is quite the mathematical leap, Mr. Houseman. "The valuation is paper money, Your Honor," Houseman smoothly replied, "tied up in corporate structure and board control. My client does not have liquidity." "I see," Judge Lawson said neutrally. She turned her attention to the petitioner's table. "Mr. Pendleton, you have a response to this fascinating interpretation of marital assets." Arthur Pendleton stood slowly. He didn't pace, he didn't posture. He simply opened the thick manila folder he had been resting his hands on. "Your Honor, we completely agree with Mr. Houseman on one specific point," Pendleton began, his voice calm and melodic. Richard frowned, glancing at his lawyer. "Agreement? That wasn't how this was supposed to work. We agree that Mr. Caldwell's company was entirely restructured 2 years ago," Pendleton continued. "And we agree that it is heavily beholden to its primary investor. In fact, we submitted Exhibit C into the court record this morning. It is a detailed breakdown of that restructuring." Pendleton handed a stack of documents to the bailiff, who passed them up to the judge. He then walked a copy over to Houseman's table. "If opposing counsel will turn to page 4, Pendleton said, returning to his seat, "you will see the exact nature of this outside funding. 2 years ago, Caldwell Tech was indeed on the brink of bankruptcy. Mr. Caldwell had over-leveraged the company on a failed software launch. To save it, he sold a 65% controlling stake to a holding company. Objection, relevance, Houseman interrupted. The corporate structure has already been disclosed. My client owns 35%, which is standard for a founder post-Series B funding. Overruled. Let him finish, Judge Lawson commanded, her eyes rapidly scanning the documents Pendleton had provided. Thank you, Your Honor. Pendleton smiled politely. Mr. Caldwell did not sell to a standard venture capital firm. He sold his controlling interest to Apex Global Partners, an umbrella corporation based out of Delaware. Mr. Caldwell believes he was negotiating with a faceless board of directors represented by their proxy attorneys. But he failed to conduct basic due diligence on who actually owns Apex Global. Richard shifted in his seat. A cold, unfamiliar sensation began to crawl up the back of his neck. He looked at Chloe, who was no longer smiling, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. He then looked at Catherine. She was still sitting perfectly upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching him with an unnerving, predatory calm. Your Honor, Pendleton's voice raised just a fraction, commanding the room. Apex Global Partners is a private wealth management shell. It has exactly one sole proprietor and chief executive officer, and she is sitting right next to me. The courtroom fell dead silent. The court stenographer's fingers hovered motionless over the keys. Houseman blinked, staring at the document in his hands. The color rapidly drained from his face as his eyes tracked the signatures on the corporate disclosures. "That's a lie!" Richard blurted out, the professional decorum breaking instantly. He stood up, pointing a shaking finger at Catherine. "That's physically impossible. Apex is a massive conglomerate. I had meetings with their reps in London." She was at home, Mr. Caldwell, sit down and restrain yourself, or I will hold you in contempt, Judge Lawson barked, her gavel hitting the sounding block with a sharp crack. Richard slowly sank back into his chair, his mind spinning. It couldn't be true. He had spent months negotiating that buyout. The lawyers for Apex had been brutal, stripping him of his veto power and strictly capping his executive salary. He had agreed to it because he thought he was playing the long game against corporate sharks. To clarify the record, Your Honor, Pendleton continued, adjusting his glasses, my client, Mrs. Catherine Montgomery Caldwell, inherited a substantial, undisclosed trust from her late grandfather 12 years ago. Rather than mingle it with marital assets, she quietly invested it. Over the last decade, she has grown Apex Global into a billion-dollar management fund. 2 years ago, when she realized her husband was driving his company into the ground, she instructed her proxies to buy him out to protect the family's future. She didn't want to bruise his ego, so she remained anonymous. Pendleton paused, letting the devastating reality hang in the air. So, returning to Mr. Houseman's argument about the division of assets, Pendleton concluded smoothly. Mr. Caldwell doesn't own a $50 million company. He is a minority shareholder and an at-will employee of my client. And as of 8 a.m. this morning, acting in her capacity as CEO of the parent company, my client has officially terminated Mr. Bees Caldwell's employment for gross misuse of corporate funds, specifically using company expense accounts to lease a luxury condominium and purchase a $45,000 diamond bracelet for his mistress, who is currently sitting in the gallery. Chloe gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her hand. Every eye in the courtroom darted toward her, then back to the visibly pale Richard Caldwell. "Business, Richard," Catherine finally spoke, her voice ringing out clear and perfectly composed in the stunned silence of the room. "We are just doing business." Gregory Houseman, a man who had built a lucrative career on never being caught off guard, physically dropped his favorite gold-plated pen. It clattered against the mahogany table, rolling off the edge and hitting the floor with a hollow ping that echoed through the paralyzed courtroom. He scrambled to gather the documents Arthur Pendleton had just served him, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal jargon, searching for a loophole, a typo, anything to prove this was a bluff. "Your Honor, this is an ambush," Houseman finally managed to stammer, his usually booming voice reduced to a reedy rasp. "We had no prior notification of these corporate maneuvers. This is a blatant violation of discovery, and I demand a recess to authenticate these utterly preposterous claims. Not dub. Judge Beatrice Lawson did not look up from the meticulously tabbed binder Pendleton had provided her. She turned a page slowly, the crisp sound of the paper slicing through the heavy silence. Mr. Houseman, according to the timestamp on these filings, your office was served with this exact financial disclosure packet at 8:03 a.m. this morning via certified electronic delivery. If you fail to check your inbox before parading into my courtroom to demand $500,000 for your client, that is a failure of your clerical staff, not a violation of discovery. She peered over her reading glasses, leveling a glare at Richard Caldwell that could freeze boiling water. Furthermore, the termination letter signed by Mrs. Caldwell, acting as CEO of Apex Global Partners, appears to be perfectly in order. Your client signed an employment contract 2 years ago that clearly stipulated immediate forfeiture of his position and remaining shares in the event of gross financial misconduct. Misconduct which, according to Exhibit F, includes siphoning corporate operational funds to a shell LLC to pay for a luxury penthouse on the Upper East Side. Richard was hyperventilating. His bespoke navy suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him as he slumped into his chair. He turned his head mechanically, looking at his wife. Catherine had not moved an inch. She wasn't gloating, she wasn't smiling. She looked exactly as she had every morning across their breakfast table, calm, collected, and entirely impenetrable. Kate, Richard choked out, ignoring his lawyer's frantic hand gestures to stay silent. Kate, you can't do this. I built that company. It was my idea, my blood, my sweat. You don't know the first thing about running a tech firm. Your tech firm was bleeding $90,000 a week when I bought it, Richard, Catherine replied, her voice cool and level. You were 6 days away from missing payroll and facing federal tax audits because you decided to lease private jets instead of paying your server hosting fees. I didn't steal your company. I salvaged it from the wreckage of your ego. In the gallery, directly behind Richard, the reality of the situation was finally penetrating the thick cloud of designer perfume surrounding Chloe Jenkins. The 24-year-old former intern had spent the last 6 months being promised the world. Richard had told her he was a multi-millionaire, an untouchable titan of industry, who was merely trapped in a dead marriage with a boring, uneducated housewife. Now that same housewife had just legally stripped him of his title, his income, and his dignity in under 10 minutes. Chloe stood up. The harsh fluorescent lights caught the brilliant sparkle of the $45,000 diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist bracelet, purchased with funds that, as of this morning, legally belonged to Catherine's holding company. Richard, Chloe whispered, her voice trembling, stripping away the confident facade she had walked in with. Richard, what is she talking about? You said you owned everything. You said the company was yours. Richard spun around, his face flushed a violent, mottled red. Chloe, sit down. Just let my lawyer handle this. It's a trick. She's bluffing. I'll get it all back by the end of the week. I promise. But Chloe wasn't looking at Richard anymore. She was looking at Catherine, who met the younger woman's gaze with an expression of profound, icy pity. Catherine slowly raised an eyebrow, a silent challenge that entirely dismantled Chloe's remaining resolve. The mistress grabbed her quilted Chanel handbag, turned on her heel, and practically sprinted toward the heavy oak doors, the rhythmic clicking of her stilettos echoing like a ticking clock marking the final seconds of Richard's ruined life. The heavy doors swung shut behind her. Richard watched her go, his mouth hanging open in a silent display of pure devastation. "Well?" Arthur Pendleton said softly, breaking the tension with a genteel, practiced sigh. "It appears the defense has lost a key witness to its character." "Enough," Judge Lawson commanded, striking her gavel once to restore absolute order. She turned her attention to Houseman. "Counselor, your client's primary argument for retaining the lion's share of the marital assets. was his status as the sole breadwinner and business owner. Given that he is now unemployed, severely in debt to his parent company for embezzled funds and facing potential civil litigation for corporate fraud, do you wish to revise your settlement offer? Houseman was sweating through his collar. He had built his reputation on winning, and he recognized a sinking ship when he saw one. He leaned away from Richard, physically distancing himself from the toxic radiation of a ruined client. Your Honor, we respectfully request a 48-hour continuance to review these new documents and confer, Houseman stammered. Granted, Judge Lawson replied sharply. But understand this, Mr. Houseman. Based on the preliminary evidence of gross financial misconduct using corporate funds to support an extramarital affair, I am issuing a temporary freezing order on all of Mr. B. Aldwell's personal accounts. He is prohibited from liquidating any remaining assets, transferring funds, or accessing the marital residence. We will reconvene on Thursday at 9 o'clock sharp. And Mr. Caldwell, such, and Richard barely lifted his head, his eyes glassy and unseeing. I strongly suggest you read the contracts you sign in the future. Court is adjourned. Dawn broke over Manhattan the following morning, casting long golden shadows across the sleek glass and steel facade of the Caldwell Tech Innovations headquarters. For 7 years, Richard had walked through the towering revolving doors as a conqueror. Today, the atmosphere in the cavernous, minimalist lobby was practically electric with whispered rumors and panicked text messages. Word of the disastrous divorce hearing had leaped through the corporate grapevine with the speed of a wildfire. Up on the 42nd floor in the sprawling executive suite that overlooked the Hudson River, Richard was in full crisis mode. He had ignored Judge Lawson's freezing order, bypassed his deactivated keycard by tailgating a junior developer into the elevator, and barricaded himself in his corner office. He was frantically pulling files from his mahogany desk, feeding sensitive internal memos into a heavy-duty shredder, and leaving increasingly unhinged voicemails for venture capitalists who had mysteriously stopped taking his calls overnight. Come on, Richard muttered to himself. His tie loosened, his eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night spent in a midtown hotel he had to pay for in cash. He just needed to secure a bridge loan. If he could get capital, he could countersue Apex Global, tie Catherine up in litigation for years, and force a settlement. He wasn't going to let a woman who spent her weekends tending to an organic garden take away his legacy. Suddenly the shredder groaned, sparked, and died. The power to the machine had been cut. Richard frowned, jiggling the power cord. Before he could investigate further, his sleek desktop computer monitor blinked out. The entire office plunged into a heavy silence, save for the hum of the central air conditioning. The heavy glass door to his office swung open. Catherine Caldwell walked in, and for the first time in their decade-long relationship, Richard realized he had never truly looked at his wife. Gone was the subservient, unassuming woman in the sensible gray suit. Today, Catherine wore a tailored, midnight blue Alexander McQueen trench coat over a razor-sharp cream pantsuit. Her hair was blown out into a sleek, imposing style, and her posture radiated the kind of terrifying absolute authority that only comes with billions of dollars in liquid capital. She was flanked by 3 people: Arthur Pendleton, looking terribly amused, a towering, broad-shouldered man in a dark suit who was clearly private security, and Thomas Reed, the company's chief technology officer. "Good morning, Richard," Catherine said. Her voice didn't echo. It simply commanded the space. "I see you managed to bypass the lobby security. We'll have to speak to building management about that." Richard took a step back, instinctively raising a hand as if to ward off a physical blow. "What are you doing here? You can't be here." "This is my office." "Actually," Catherine said, slowly peeling off a pair of leather gloves and placing them neatly on the conference table, "this is my office. As of 8 o'clock yesterday morning, you were officially terminated for cause." "Thomas, Could you confirm the status of the former CEO's network access? Thomas Reed, a brilliant but notoriously nervous engineer whom Richard had bullied mercilessly for years, adjusted his glasses and looked at his tablet. He didn't look at Richard. Yes, Mrs. Caldwell, all Active Directory accounts, email servers, and biometric access points associated with Mr. Caldwell have been permanently revoked. Furthermore, IT has locked down his local drives to preserve evidence of the unauthorized expenditures. Now, Thank you, Thomas. Catherine smiled, a genuine, warm smile that made the CTO stand a little taller. You can return to your team. Let them know there will be a company-wide town hall at noon to introduce the new interim executive board. I assure everyone that jobs are secure and the quarterly bonuses will be paid out as promised. Thomas nodded gratefully and quickly exited the room, leaving Richard isolated with his wife, her lawyer, and a security guard who looked entirely capable of throwing Richard through the plate glass window. You're destroying my company just to get back at me, Richard snarled, stepping out from behind his desk. This isn't about business, Kate. This is petty revenge because of Chloe. Because I found someone who actually appreciates me. Catherine laughed. It wasn't a bitter laugh, nor an angry one. It was a soft, genuine chuckle that cut Richard deeper than any scream ever could. Richard, please give me some credit, Catherine said, walking slowly around the perimeter of the office, examining the expensive, tasteless modern art he had hung on the walls. I knew about Chloe 6 months ago. I also knew about Sarah from marketing 2 years ago, and that cocktail waitress in Miami before her. Your infidelities were tedious, predictable, and remarkably cheap. I didn't care about your mistresses. She stopped in front of him, closing the distance until she was mere inches away. She didn't flinch when he breathed heavily, reeking of stale scotch and panic. I cared about the money, she whispered, her eyes locking onto his with predatory intensity. My grandfather left me a fortune, and I spent a decade learning how to multiply it while you were busy playing tech bro and running this company into a brick wall. I watched you waste millions on vanity projects. I watched you insult brilliant engineers like Thomas. I watched you treat this business like a personal piggy bank. She turned away, dismissing his presence entirely, and walked over to the desk, running a hand over the polished wood. When you drove the company to the brink of bankruptcy, I had 2 choices, Catherine continued, projecting her voice to the room. I could let you fail, let 500 employees lose their livelihoods, and watch you drag our personal finances down with you. Or I could use my resources to quietly buy the debt, restructure the board, and put you on a leash. I signed those papers because I trusted my lawyers. Richard yelled, his voice cracking in sheer desperation. They told me Apex was a legitimate firm. Apex is a legitimate firm, Arthur Pendleton chimed in from the doorway, checking his pocket watch. It manages over $4 billion in assets globally. Mrs. Caldwell just happens to be the exceptionally private chairwoman. And to correct the record, your lawyers advised you not to sign the buyout. You signed it anyway because the Apex proxy offered you a vanity title and a corner office, and your ego simply couldn't comprehend reading the fine print of a restrictive covenant. Catherine motioned to the security guard. Mr. Caldwell is trespassing. Please escort him to the lobby. Allow him to take only his personal keys and his mobile phone. Everything else in this room is corporate property. The large guard stepped forward, placing a heavy, immovable hand on Richard's shoulder. You're going to leave me with nothing, Richard asked, his voice finally breaking, the reality of his total annihilation crashing down upon him. 10 years, Kate. 10 years and you're just throwing me out on the street? Catherine paused at the door, looking back over her shoulder. The lighting caught the sharp angles of her face, illuminating the brilliant, terrifying mind that Richard had completely underestimated for a decade. I'm not leaving you with nothing, Richard, Catherine said softly, her voice devoid of any warmth. I'm leaving you with exactly what you brought to this marriage. Yourself. Sunlight glared off the polished glass doors of the Caldwell Tech Innovations building, nearly blinding Richard as the private security guard forcefully marched him out onto the crowded pavement of Avenue of the Americas. The guard didn't say a word, simply releasing his grip on Richard's bespoke suit jacket before turning on his heel and retreating into the air-conditioned sanctuary of the lobby. The heavy glass doors sealed shut with a soft, dismissive click. Richard stood frozen on the sidewalk, engulfed by the deafening roar of midtown Manhattan traffic. Pedestrians bumped into his shoulders, muttering curses as they navigated around him, entirely unaware that the man they were shoving had, only 24 hours prior, considered himself a master of the universe. He reached into his pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out his mobile phone. It was the only piece of technology Catherine had permitted him to keep. His first instinct was survival, his second was vengeance. He scrolled furiously through his contacts and hit the dial button for Gregory Houseman. The phone rang 4 times before going to a sterile voicemail. Richard called again, and again. On the 4th attempt, the line clicked open, but the voice on the other end wasn't the booming, confident shark who had swaggered into family court. It was a cold, irritated sigh. "Gregory, you need to file an emergency injunction," Richard barked, pacing a tight circle near a hot dog stand. "She locked me out of the building. She humiliated me in front of my CTO. Call the judge. Call the SEC. Call whoever you have to call. I want Apex Global audited, and I want my damn office back by 3 o'clock. Mr. Caldwell, I strongly advise you to lower your voice and listen very carefully to what I am about to tell you," Houseman replied, his tone devoid of any former camaraderie. "At 9:15 this morning, my firm's accounting department received an alert from JP Morgan Chase. The wire transfer you initiated yesterday to replenish your legal retainer was flagged and reversed. Your primary checking account, your savings, and your offshore brokerage accounts have all been completely frozen by a federal marshal's order, executed under Judge Lawson's temporary injunction." Richard stopped pacing. A cold knot formed in the pit of his stomach. "Frozen, Gregory? I've over $4 million in liquid cash in that Chase account. They can't just freeze it over a divorce dispute." "They can, and they did, because this is no longer just a divorce dispute," Houseman snapped, his patience officially exhausted. "Your wife's legal team didn't just file for a division of marital assets. Arthur Pendleton filed a civil suit at 8:30 this morning on behalf of Apex Global Partners, alleging massive corporate fraud and embezzlement. Because you used company funds from Caldwell Tech to finance your mistress's lifestyle, violating your fiduciary duty to your parent company, Apex has placed a lien on every single asset attached to your social security number to recoup the stolen funds." Richard leaned heavily against a metal lamppost, the world spinning sickeningly around him. "But you're my lawyer. You have to fight this. We can countersue for hostile takeover." "I am a partner at a premium law firm, Richard, not a charity," Houseman stated brutally. "Without a cleared retainer, I cannot legally represent you. Furthermore, associating my firm with a CEO who was caught embezzling from his own parent company to buy diamond bracelets is a reputational risk I am not willing to take. Consider this a formal, verbal notification of my withdrawal as your legal counsel. A hard copy is being couriered to your last known address. Do not call this number again." The line went dead. Richard stared at the screen, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was stranded in the middle of Manhattan with no lawyer, no company, and no access to his bank accounts. He opened his banking app, desperately hoping Houseman was exaggerating. A glaring red banner stretched across the screen, ACC out and restrict. "Please contact your branch manager. Available balance, 0 tons." Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally breached his defenses. He needed to get to safety. He needed to regroup. He opened his Uber app to summon a black car to his luxury penthouse on the Upper East Side, the penthouse he had leased specifically for his clandestine meetings with Chloe. He typed in the address on East 72nd Street and hit request. Payment method declined. He swore loudly, earning a glare from a passing businesswoman. He switched the payment to his corporate American Express. Card suspended. Forced to swallow the last shreds of his pride, Richard flagged down a yellow cab, promising the driver he had cash upstairs. The agonizing 30-minute ride uptown felt like a funeral procession. When the taxi finally pulled up to the ornate pre-war building, Richard tossed his expensive Rolex watch into the front seat. "Keep it," he muttered to the stunned driver, sprinting toward the brass-handled double doors. He pushed through the entrance, expecting the usual warm greeting from Davies, the veteran doorman who always turned a blind eye to Richard's late-night visitors. Instead, Davies stepped out from behind the mahogany podium, physically blocking Richard's path to the elevators. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell," Davies said, his expression completely neutral. "I'm afraid I cannot let you up." "Davies, get out of my way. I've had the worst morning of my life, and I need a shower," Richard growled, attempting to sidestep the older man. Davies didn't budge. He pulled a crisp sheet of paper from his pocket and unfolded it. "I received a hand-delivered notice at 8 o'clock this morning from the property management firm that owns this building, sir. They've terminated your lease, effective immediately, citing a breach of contract regarding the source of your rental payments. The locks on penthouse 4B have already been changed." "Changed?" Richard's voice cracked. "My clothes are in there. Chloe is in there. Miss Jenkins departed the premises at approximately 9:30 this morning, sir," Davies informed him politely, though a flicker of disdain crossed his eyes. "She carried 2 large suitcases and requested a taxi to JFK Airport. She left a keycard with me. As for your belongings, the management company has packed them into 3 standard cardboard boxes. They are waiting for you in the service alley by the loading dock." Richard stumbled backward, bumping into a marble pillar. The penthouse wasn't his. The money wasn't his. Even his own clothes had been relegated to the garbage alley. He pulled out his phone and dialed Chloe's number, a desperate plea forming on his lips. He would beg her to come back. They could sell the diamond bracelet. They could start over. "The number you have reached is no longer in service." She had burned the phone. She had packed her designer bags, taken the jewelry he had stolen to buy her, and vanished the moment she realized the money printer had been unplugged. Richard Caldwell, the visionary tech founder, the master manipulator, sank to the cold marble floor of the lobby, burying his face in his hands as the true, devastating architecture of his wife's revenge finally became clear. Back on the 42nd floor, the atmosphere had shifted from chaotic panic to an intense, focused quiet. The expansive executive boardroom was packed to capacity, standing room only, as department heads, lead developers, and senior marketing staff murmured nervously among themselves. They had all expected a bloodbath. When a founder is ousted, mass layoffs usually follow. The heavy oak doors opened, and Catherine Caldwell walked to the head of the massive glass conference table. She didn't swagger, nor did she demand their attention. She simply possessed it. Arthur Pendleton stood quietly by the window, observing the room with a practiced, predatory calm. "Good afternoon, everyone. Please, take a seat if you have one, or make yourselves comfortable," Catherine began, a voice carrying effortlessly across the large room. She opened a sleek, leather-bound portfolio and extracted a single sheet of notes. "By now you are all aware that Richard Caldwell is no longer the chief executive officer of this company, nor is he affiliated with Caldwell Tech Innovations or our parent holding company, Apex Global. I am stepping in as the interim CEO until the board appoints a permanent replacement." A brave senior engineer near the back raised his hand. "Ma'am, with respect, are we filing for Chapter 11? Mr. Vax, Mr. Missinett, Caldwell told us last week that our runway was shrinking. He said the logistics algorithm update was draining our capital." Catherine offered the man a reassuring, confident smile. "You are referring to the Routemaster Pro deployment, correct?" The engineer nodded, visibly surprised she knew the project name. "Routemaster Pro wasn't draining the capital," Catherine stated clearly, tapping a finger on her folder. The algorithm you all built is spectacular. It is currently 20% more efficient than anything our competitors have on the market. What was draining the capital was a toxic culture of executive overreach, specifically $3 million diverted to sponsor a Formula One racing team, $1 million spent on a luxury corporate retreat in Dubai that only upper management attended, and highly irregular expense accounts. A collective gasp followed by angry muttering rippled through the room. As of this morning, Catherine continued, raising a hand to quiet them, Apex Global has fully capitalized Coldwell Tech. The Formula One sponsorship has been legally voided, the Dubai contracts cancelled, and those recovered funds are being immediately reallocated to R&D and server infrastructure. There will be 0 layoffs. In fact, Thomas Reed is being promoted to Chief Operating Officer, and I expect him to open requisitions for 12 new back-end engineers by Friday. Thomas Reed, sitting near the front, looked as though he might pass out from sheer relief. The room erupted into spontaneous, genuine applause. Catherine had done more than just save the company. She had excised the rot and validated their hard work. She wasn't just a shadow investor. She was a brilliant, decisive leader who understood the actual value of her assets. While Catherine was stabilizing an empire, Richard was desperately trying to burn it to the ground. 3 miles downtown, sitting in a dimly lit booth at the back of Smith & Wollensky, Richard was nervously nursing a glass of tap water. Across from him sat Harrison Cole, the ruthless billionaire CEO of Meridian Tech, Caldwell's largest and most aggressive competitor. Cole was slicing into a rare ribeye, looking thoroughly amused by the sweaty, disheveled man sitting opposite him. "So, let me get this straight, Richard," Cole said, chewing slowly. "You called my private cell, begged for a meeting, and showed up looking like you slept in a dumpster just to tell me you've been fired from your own company?" "It's a hostile takeover by my soon-to-be ex-wife," Richard hissed, leaning over the table, his eyes wide and frantic. "She bought the debt through a shell company. But she made a massive miscalculation, Harrison. A fatal error." Toe raised an eyebrow, gesturing with his steak knife for Richard to continue. "She owns the LLC. She owns the office furniture, the employee contracts, the branding." Richard smiled, a terrifying, unhinged grin stretching across his face. "But she doesn't own the core intellectual property. When I built the first iteration of the logistics software 8 years ago, I didn't file the patents under Coldwell Tech. I filed them under a separate holding shell to protect myself. Without those patents, Coldwell Tech software is completely worthless. I can legally issue a cease and desist tomorrow, shutting down their entire network." Richard pulled a wrinkled manila envelope from his jacket and slid it across the table. "I'm offering you exclusive rights to the patents. You buy the IP from me for $10 million cash. Today, you implement my code into Meridian Tech, and you completely destroy Catherine and Coldwell Tech in one move. You win the market, and I get my capital back." Harrison Cole stopped chewing. He set his knife and fork down, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. He didn't look at the envelope. He simply looked at Richard with an expression of profound, almost painful pity. "Richard," Cole sighed, signaling the waiter for the check, "did you ever actually read the documents you signed when you set up that separate holding shell 8 years ago?" Richard frowned, his triumphant smile faltering. "What? Yes, of course. It was called Bluebird Ventures. I signed the United States Patent and Trademark Office filings myself." "You did," Cole nodded slowly. "You signed the USPTO filings as the inventing contributor. But you didn't fund the filing fees, did you? You were broke back then, living in a walk-up in Brooklyn." "My wife paid the legal fees," Richard stammered, the cold dread returning, crawling up his spine with 1,000 icy legs. "From a small inheritance. It was just clerical work. I was the founder. Harrison Cole reached into his own briefcase sitting on the bench beside him and pulled out a sleek tablet. He tapped the screen a few times and slid it across the table, right over Richard's untouched envelope. "I had my legal team do a deep dive on your company 2 years ago when we considered acquiring you, before Apex beat us to it," Cole explained, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "Bluebird Ventures isn't a shell company owned by you, Richard. It is a fully registered blind trust, and the sole beneficiary and executing officer of that trust is Catherine Montgomery Caldwell. When she paid your filing fees 8 years ago, she had her lawyers structure the ownership. You assigned the patent rights to Bluebird Ventures in perpetuity, in exchange for a one-time payment of $1. Richard stared at the tablet screen. Displayed in high resolution was the original patent assignment contract. There at the bottom was his own signature, scrawled hastily on a kitchen table a decade ago, legally signing away the rights to his life's work to his wife's trust. He had been so obsessed with being a genius that he had never bothered to read the fine print. "She didn't just buy your company, Richard," Cole said softly, sliding out of the leather booth and buttoning his suit jacket. "She owned your software before Caldwell Tech even existed. She owned your success before you even knew what success was. You have nothing to sell me. You have nothing at all." Cole tossed a $100 bill onto the table to cover his stake and walked away, leaving Richard completely alone in the dark restaurant. There were no more moves to make. No more legal loopholes. No more wealthy allies to manipulate. Catherine hadn't just defeated him. She had systematically dismantled every single aspect of his identity, leaving him with the absolute agonizing truth. He was never the king of the empire. He had only ever been a pawn on her board. Heavy rain battered the tall, reinforced windows of the Manhattan family court on Thursday morning, casting long gray shadows across the polished mahogany of courtroom 302. Just 3 days prior, the room had been a stage for Richard Caldwell's arrogant theatrics. Today it felt more like an execution chamber. Richard sat completely alone at the respondent's table. He wore the same bespoke navy suit from Monday, though it was now hopelessly wrinkled, smelling faintly of damp wool and stale coffee. He hadn't shaved. The dark, bruised bags under his eyes spoke of 72 sleepless hours spent frantically calling every contact in his phone, only to find that his entire network had evaporated the moment his net worth hit zero. Across the aisle, Catherine sat with perfect, terrifying composure. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer over a crisp silk blouse, a posture as straight and unyielding as a steel beam. Beside her, Arthur Pendleton was casually organizing a slim folder of documents. He didn't need thick binders of evidence anymore. The war was already over. At exactly 9 o'clock, the bailiff announced the arrival of the Honorable Judge Beatrice Lawson. She took her seat at the bench, adjusted her reading glasses, and looked down at the severely diminished man sitting before her. "Good morning," Judge Lawson began, her voice echoing in the quiet room. "The court recognizes that the respondent, Mr. Caldwell, is now appearing pro se, following the formal withdrawal of his previous counsel. Mr. Caldwell, are you prepared to proceed without legal representation, or do you require a court-appointed attorney to navigate this settlement?" Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. He stood up slowly, gripping the edge of the table to steady his trembling hands. "I'll represent myself, Your Honor. I have no funds to retain new counsel." "Very well," Judge Lawson noted, her tone devoid of sympathy. "Mr. Pendleton, given the explosive financial disclosures introduced during Monday's session and the subsequent civil filings by Apex Global Partners, how does the petitioner wish to proceed regarding the division of marital assets?" Arthur Pendleton stood, buttoning his jacket. "Your Honor, in light of the undeniable evidence that Mr. Caldwell embezzled approximately $1.2 million in corporate funds from Caldwell Tech Innovations to finance an extramarital affair and secure a private luxury lease, the mathematics of the marital estate have fundamentally shifted." Pendleton walked a single stapled document over to Richard's table, sliding it across the wood before handing a copy to the bailiff for the judge. "My client has authorized me to offer a final, non-negotiable settlement," Pendleton continued smoothly. "Mrs. Caldwell will assume full ownership of the primary marital residence in Connecticut. Furthermore, because the intellectual property of the software company was legally assigned to my client's blind trust 8 years ago, Mr. Prosnish, Caldwell has no equity claim to the business. However, my client is offering a remarkable act of grace." Richard stared down at the document, his bloodshot eyes struggling to focus on the dense legal text. "If Mr. Caldwell signs this final divorce decree today, waiving any right to alimony or future claims against the estate, Apex Global Partners will officially drop the civil suit regarding the embezzled $1.2 million, Pendleton explained, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "My client will absorb the debt of his infidelity. In exchange, Mr. Caldwell walks away with his personal effects, the balance of his checking account prior to the freeze, which is exactly zero, and his freedom from federal fraud charges. He gets a clean, albeit penniless, slate." The courtroom was suffocatingly silent. It was a brutal, flawless checkmate. Catherine wasn't just taking his money, she was holding the keys to his physical freedom. If he fought her, she would unleash her corporate lawyers, bury him in civil litigation, and hand his forged expense reports directly to the district attorney. Richard slowly raised his head, looking directly at the woman he had underestimated for 10 years. "You planned this," he whispered, his voice cracking. "You let me build it. You let me think I was the king, just so you could take it all away when I made a mistake." Catherine didn't blink. She turned her head slightly, meeting his broken gaze with eyes as cold and deep as the ocean. "I didn't plan for your failure, Richard," Catherine said softly, her voice carrying easily across the short distance between them. "I planned for our future. I protected the assets when you recklessly gambled them away. I paid for the patents when you couldn't afford the filing fees. I was your partner, but you decided I was just an accessory. You didn't make a mistake, Richard. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary. You made a series of calculated, arrogant choices to betray me. I simply made a calculated choice to survive you." She turned back to face the front of the room, entirely dismissing his existence. "Sign the paper, Richard, or Arthur makes the call to the DA." Richard's hand shook violently as he picked up the cheap plastic pen provided by the court. He looked at the signature line. With one stroke he would erase his legacy, his fortune, and his marriage. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, the ghost of his former ego screaming at him to fight, but the suffocating reality of a prison cell crushed it instantly. He pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name. "Let the record show the respondent has signed the settlement agreement," Judge Lawson declared, striking her gavel with a sharp, echoing crack. "The marital assets will be divided as stipulated. The temporary freezing orders on Mr. Conte Caldwell's accounts are lifted, though I suspect that offers little comfort. List divorce is granted. Court is adjourned." Catherine stood up gracefully. She didn't look back at the table where Richard was quietly weeping into his hands. She simply buttoned her charcoal blazer, nodded to her attorney, and walked out the heavy oak doors, stepping out of the shadows of a broken marriage and into the brilliant, uncompromising light of the empire she truly owned. Catherine Caldwell's brilliant, silent execution of her divorce is a masterclass in strategy, patience, and the fatal cost of underestimating the people closest to you. Richard walked into that courtroom believing he was a titan of industry, ready to discard his loyal wife for a fleeting, expensive distraction. He learned the hard way that true power doesn't need to boast, brag, or wear designer suits to prove its worth. Catherine didn't just win the divorce. She reclaimed her financial genius, protected her family's legacy, and delivered a consequence so absolute that it shook the entire corporate world. What did you think of Catherine's ultimate checkmate? Was it a justified response to a decade of betrayal, or the coldest corporate takeover in history? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. hit that like button and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more jaw-dropping, real-life courtroom dramas.